When dealing with merchandise inventory, some of the new terminology you'll hear is credit and debit memorandums. But what exactly does this mean, and what are these memos for? Well, you have to think about the transaction and both sides of it. For the seller, if they have an accounts receivable of $500, then there will be a buyer somewhere who also has an accounts payable of $500. You're going to have that even balance, not only within your debits and credits, but between yourself and your customer. So from the seller's perspective, the customer calls, let's say the customer calls the seller, wants to return defective merchandise inventory that was purchased. When merchandise is returned, the seller will credit the buyer's accounts receivable. And they will send a credit memorandum to that customer just to let them know they have credited their account. That is called a credit memorandum because that's what they're doing. All this is a source document. It's communication. So the seller then credited the accounts receivable $100, sent them a credit memo to let them know. The buyer then receives what is being called a credit memo, and they're going to do the opposite. They're not going to credit, they're going to debit something, and that's going to be their accounts payable. When you receive a memo, you do the opposite. The buyer then acknowledges receipt of by issuing a debit memo. So whatever you are doing, that is what you're calling the memo, whether it's a credit memo or a debit memo. The credit memo, the seller decreased the accounts receivable by crediting it, so that they just simply communicated to the buyer with a credit memo that they credited their account. If the buyer wants to communicate with the seller that they are decreasing the accounts payable, they then send a debit memo. So if you issue a memorandum, that's what you're doing. But if you receive a memo, you do the opposite. If you send a credit memo, you credit your accounts receivable. If you receive a credit memo, you will debit your accounts payable. If you send a debit memo, you're debiting your accounts payable. That's what you're doing. If you send a debit memo, you're debiting something. And if you receive a debit memo, you're going to do the opposite. You're going to credit your accounts receivable. So credit and debit memorandums, what are they? It's just communication. It's a source document.